Good afternoon. My name is Michelle Ashton. I'm the Director of Communications for the Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida. And on behalf of our entire board and staff, I want to thank you so much for taking an hour out of your busy day to talk with us about Florida's deer. A couple of quick housekeeping items before we get going. I ask for everybody to please stay mute and remain muted throughout our duration of time so you don't have hearing helicopters flying over like you're hearing from me right now. The one exception to that would be during our Q&A portion. You can ask questions a couple different ways during that time. You can use the raise your hand feature, at which point I'll ask you to unmute and you can talk directly with our guests. Or if you prefer, you can drop your question in the chat at any point and I can ask the question for you. That feature is especially helpful if you have a question pop up that you want to make sure you don't forget. The Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida was founded in 1994 as a citizen support organization for FWC. We're an independent nonprofit that's dedicated to conserving wildlife and outdoor recreation in Florida. Since our founding, we've raised and granted out over $52 million for projects supporting our mission. One of the ways that we're able to raise that money and provide grants is through 4 of our specialty plates. You can see one of them, the Wildlife Foundation of Florida, or as more commonly known, the deer plate behind me right now. In the last 4 years alone, we've been able to give $267,712 for deer-related projects, thanks to people purchasing and renewing their deer plate. Over 122,000 of that has been related just to projects for chronic wasting disease. I'm really grateful to have joining me today 2 deer experts. We have FWC Deer Program Management Coordinator Cory Morea and FWC Veterinarian Mark Cunningham. Cory, I'm going to send it over to you.
Great, thank you, Michelle. And as I start my presentation here, I just want to say thank you to the foundation for all their great efforts and supporting conservation, and particularly, as Michelle mentioned, some of the projects that have benefited deer in the state. So just quick check, Michelle, is that viewing appropriately?
No, it's doing so I think we have to click on that drop down like we did, Cory, during a little while ago. Yeah.
How's that?
Perfect.
All right. Well, great. So thank you for that introduction, Michelle. As she mentioned, I'm the Deer Management Program Coordinator for Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. I've been in this role since December 2008, so starting to get a little tenure in the position. And during that time, we've been able to accomplish many changes to how we manage deer in the state, and many of those changes are based on public input, stakeholder input. We value that input greatly when dealing with management issues with deer, so we really appreciate our stakeholder involvement. So I'll basically be covering deer biology in Florida, how it's unique, and then also how we manage deer in the state. So when we talk about deer management, it gets back to the public trust doctrine, which is that wildlife resources in the United States, they're not owned by any individual. They are owned and held in trust by the government for the benefit of future and present generations. So basically what this means is that our state agency and and partner federal agencies are responsible for managing the resource for the benefit of the people. To help guide management actions and how we manage deer in the state of Florida, we had developed a strategic plan for deer management. And part of that plan has three larger goals: population goal, which, essentially to ensure that there's existence of robust deer population that meets the desires of the public, while protecting property and ensuring the long-term welfare of the species. We have a customer satisfaction goal, which is to ensure a high degree of public satisfaction with deer management in Florida. And again, I tie that back to how we value stakeholder input highly as we deal with managing this popular resource. And the plan also has a habitat goal, which is to encourage management of habitats in Florida to promote deer population goals and customer satisfaction goals. And if you're interested in viewing the strategic plan for deer management, you can see that at myfwc.com/deer. So when we talk about deer in Florida, we really have to point out how deer are different in Florida. First, we have 4 subspecies of deer in Florida, and that's more than any other state, with the smallest of the deer being the Florida key deer, which are only located in the Keys. And then as you move north in the state, we have 3 different other subspecies, which to the average person are very difficult to discern between the 3. But we have more subspecies than any other state. When we talk about deer biology in Florida, we need to talk about deer population and deer population growth. If you look at these 2 curves here, the top curve would be more representative of the deer populations in Georgia and Alabama. Those states have, in general, better soils and better habitat, and as a result, they reproduce at a higher rate and can have higher carrying capacities than much of Florida. So if you think about a population that starts off at a very low level, and one of those populations is in Georgia or Alabama, you can see that as time goes on, that deer population growth rate increases much more rapidly in those states than it does in Florida. It takes a longer time for Florida deer populations to build up if they're at a low level. And that's one reason why we are conservative with our antlerless deer harvest, in particular the harvest female deer, because we simply cannot support the harvest levels of does like some of these other states that have higher densities and higher reproductive rates. And when we talk about hunting in Florida, many hunters want to hunt during the rut. It's also when antlers are hard. Bucks have their antlers fully developed. And as you can see from this generalized map of rut dates in Florida, we have the most variable rut range throughout the state than any other state. Where you look at in extreme South Florida, in the Big Cypress, Everglades areas, the average conception date for deer down there is in August. It can be as early as mid to late July. And then as you move north in the state, it gets later. We do have that pocket to the east of Tampa where it's an island of a later rut date that's really unique. And then as you get in the Florida Panhandle, you can see that as you move from east to west, we have a November peak, then December in the Tallahassee area. And then as you move further west, it gets into January and into February, almost into March. So we have considerable variation in our rut dates throughout the state. Part of these differences are dependent upon our habitat characteristics in the state. And this is a map of major ecoregions in the state. And deer habitat characteristics and deer growth and reproductive characteristics can vary based on these habitat differences, with some of the more productive soils and populations being in North Florida, and then various pockets in the state that have better soils and habitats. So as a result of all these unique characteristics of Florida's deer population, for one, we have 4 hunting zones in the state. And hunting zones are used to set season timing, start and end dates. And when we set those start and end dates, we consulted with the public, our stakeholders extensively, and we heard things that were important to them were that, you know, obviously we want our bucks to have hard antlers so they can be easily discernible from females. Then you have preferences such as trying to hunt during cooler weather, during holidays, and other particular times of the year when hunters like to be out, including the rut. So these 4 zones help reflect and capture those preferences of stakeholders, as well as the differences in rut timing. So in recent years, we also developed deer management units. Deer management units are a subdivision within Florida that have unique combinations of deer population characteristics, deer habitat, land use patterns, and deer stakeholder interests. We thought it was important for these deer management units to be easily discernible on the ground. So instead of using political boundaries like county boundaries, we chose to go with major roads or water features to delineate DMU boundaries. And this was also widely supported by our stakeholders. So and within Zone A, we have 3 units. Zone B is a unit itself. Zone C has 6, and Zone D has 2 units. So here's a map of the deer management units in Florida. And you can see that one of the things that vary based on the deer management unit are antler regulations for harvest. So the areas that are in white on that map, that requires a 3-point on a side or 10-inch main beam for an antler deer to be legal to be harvested. And the areas in gray require at least 2 antler points on one side for it to be legal to be harvested. And these differences are based on deer information that we studied and developed these regulations to protect 1.5-year-old bucks from harvest. So it's not about trophy management. It's just about protecting that 1.5-year-old age class when bucks are most vulnerable and their antler development is just beginning, and to promote more deer being taken into or moved into that 2.5-year-old and older age classes when their body size and antler characteristics begin to grow. So just wanted to point out an example of a 3-point on a side deer. And that's probably a 2.5-year-old deer that was harvested there. And then an example of a deer with 2 points on the side, basically commonly referred to as a forked antler deer. So those would be legal to take in their respective deer management units that have those antler requirements. When you talk about harvest management on private lands, we have a couple different programs available to assist landowners in managing their deer populations on their lands. So we have the Antlerless Deer Permit Program. This allows the landowners with 640 acres to apply to get an antlerless deer permit and tags, which allows antlerless deer to be harvested throughout the season. And one thing to note is that this is our 3rd season where if private lands are enrolled in the antlerless deer program, that all antlerless deer taken on those lands must be tagged regardless of season type. So even during archery or during the DMU specific antlerless deer days during gun season, if you're enrolled in this program, you still have to use a tag on those days. And the general issuance rate for antlerless deer tags is 1 tag per 150 acres in most of the deer management units, while some of our lower density deer management units, we have a standard issuance rate of 1 tag per 300 acres. And we also have another program that's called the Private Lands Deer Management Permit Program. This program is available for properties that are 5,000 acres in size or larger. And to be a part of this program, they have to develop a habitat and deer management plan for the property by a certified wildlife biologist. And they must commit to at least 4 conservation practices on the property that impacts 10% of the land each year. And that must be documented each year also by a certified wildlife biologist. And as a result, they have some flexibility in harvest opportunities. They can use any method to take during the entire season. And an additional benefit in Zone A is that they can adjust their season to no more than 128 days, which is the standard season format for most zones. But they can use it to close up portion of that month-long closure in Zone A if they so desire. And for that program, the standard tag issuance rate is 1 antler deer tag and 1 antlerless deer tag per 150 acres. So they're limited both on the number of antler deer and antlerless deer that they may take on those properties. So switching over to public land hunting opportunities, and we're fortunate in Florida to have a significant wildlife management area system, a lot of public lands, and we every single wildlife management area have their own unique harvest regulations. And this has come about because We have different managing agencies that have different needs and requirements. And also, as we work with our stakeholders, they help us shape these regulations on each of these areas. So they end up getting essentially customized to customer preferences as well as cooperator needs. Most of the hunts on wildlife management areas fall within the zonal seasons in which the WMA is located. And we really try to manage for a diversity of hunting opportunities. So we have some areas in the state that you have to have a quota permit, and there's limited access and limited hunting opportunities, which generally promotes more game and higher hunter success rate. And we also have large areas that require no quota permit, where you can just pick up on a whim and go hunting, as long as you have the correct licenses and permits. And so we have these areas throughout the state. We try to manage that diversity of hunting opportunities. And do just want to point out that FWC is not the lead managing agency on most WMAs. We actually coordinate with other government agencies such as the Water Management District, Florida Forest Service, and others to allow hunting on many of those properties. So a big part of managing deer in Florida is to manage the harvest in our deer populations. So we have deer harvest, and hunter effort is estimated by a randomized telephone survey of hunters after the season is ended. And we've been doing this survey now for about 10 years, and we encourage anyone that receives a call in the spring asking to participate in this survey to please participate. The results provide harvest data at the statewide, zonal, and deer management unit level. And we also now have mandatory harvest reporting for deer harvested in the state, and that was implemented in 2019 and complements the telephone survey. So we have two sources of monitoring harvest of our deer in the state. So here's a long range graph of the number of deer harvested over time. So you can see prior to the 1950s, deer population was extremely low due to unrestricted hunting. We put regulations in place to help manage and grow the deer population, as well as many releases of deer moved around the state to areas where they were void to help promote that growth of the population in the state. And you can see it's reflected based on the harvest over time, that it's generally been increasing, and is reflective of the great conservation efforts and that our agency and others have worked to help bring deer to be as plentiful as they are today. So something that's now also in the third year of being in place is logging and reporting harvested deer. So anytime a deer is taken in Florida, it must be logged and reported within 24 hours. And there's multiple ways of doing that. You can log and report on a mobile device using Florida FWC's Fish Hunt Florida app, or at gooutdoorsflorida.com prior to moving the deer, and that log and reports it simultaneously. We especially encourage the use of the Fish Hunt Florida app. It's the simplest way to report. The second option is to log on a paper harvest log, which you can get offline. And that allows you to move the deer and begin field dressing. And then you can report at either online or with the app or by calling the toll-free number within 24 hours or before taking the deer or deer parts to a taxidermist meat processor. And as I mentioned, this is complementary to our annual hunter survey that we do, and also helps to promote compliance with our annual statewide bag limit of 5 deer per hunter, which includes no more than 2 antlerless deer per year. And wanted to point out that we now have new regulations related to importing deer carcasses into Florida. Under the new rules, which went into effect in July, you're allowed to bring back deboned meat, finished taxidermy mounts, clean hides and antlers, skulls, skull caps, and teeth if all the soft tissue has been removed. And so that's in place for it anywhere out of the state of Florida, with the only exception being if property is in Georgia and Florida and owned by the same person. If the deer is taken on that Georgia, Alabama property, it can be brought into the state without any exceptions. So now I'm going to show a quick video, after which we will have Mark Cunningham take over for the second half of the presentation.
Is there supposed to be sound?
Yeah, Cory, we're not hearing the audio.
Or high-risk parts of all members of the deer family that originate from anywhere outside of Florida. Under these rules, people may import into Florida deboned meat, finished taxidermy mounts, antlers, hides, and skulls if all soft tissue has been removed. The only exception to this rule is deer harvested from a property in Georgia or Alabama can be imported into Florida if the property is bisected by the Florida state line and is under the same ownership. CWD is one of the most serious wildlife diseases facing our country today. This infectious disease of the brain and central nervous system has been detected in 26 states and 3 Canadian provinces, and there's no cure, no vaccine, and it's always fatal for members of the deer family. The abnormal proteins or prions that cause CWD can be transmitted through direct animal-to-animal contact. Deer can also become infected when browsing an area contaminated by CWD prions. An infected animal can shed CWD prions onto the soil through feces, urine, saliva, and other bodily fluids, or its decomposing carcass. These CWD prions persist in the environment for years, even after a prescribed burn. Currently, there is no scientific evidence that CWD can be transmitted to humans. The disease appears to spread through natural movement of CWD-infected animals. However, transporting hunter-killed deer, elk, moose, and caribou carcasses with CWD is believed to be one of the primary ways the disease is spread over long distances. You can help protect deer populations by following the rules related to importing deer into Florida that are harvested out of state. Also, if you see or harvest a sick or extremely skinny deer, avoid handling it and call the CWD hotline. You can also support the FWC's CWD monitoring efforts by voluntarily submitting your deer heads for testing. CWD surveillance is important to verify our state is still free of CWD. It's also critical for detecting the disease as soon as possible to prevent it from spreading. We urge you to unite against CWD and help us ensure there will always be healthy deer populations in Florida. This video was made possible through funding from Wildlife Alert, a nonprofit reward program created to encourage citizens to report wildlife violations. Distribution of the video is supported by a Fish and Wildlife Foundation of Florida grant. Funds for this grant came from the sale of the foundation's specialty deer tag license plate.
All right, so hopefully that video helped explain some of the dangers of bringing potentially infected CWD carcasses into the state. And this will kind of lead us up into Dr. Mark Cunningham's presentation now, as he'll focus on chronic wasting disease and our efforts to and surveillance for that disease. So Mark, I will go ahead and give you remote access.
All right, appreciate it, Cory. So yeah, my name's Mark. I'm a wildlife veterinarian with FWC. I'm the leader of the wildlife health program here in Gainesville, and we're responsible for, among other things, disease surveillance and really all wildlife species, but we really focus on deer especially. There are a number of diseases of concern, and a lot of our work is funded through the Wildlife Foundation. So very much appreciate that support. And let's see if I can advance it. Yeah, I'm not, oh, there we go. Okay, so the video went over this a little bit, but just some background on CWD, or chronic wasting disease. So this is an infectious protein. So it's a very different kind of pathogen than most infectious diseases we're familiar with, like viruses or bacteria, protozoa, funguses, things like that. So this is an infectious protein, a misfolded version of a normal protein that mammals have in the body. And it's a relatively uncommon type of disease. This is the only transmissible spongiform encephalopathy or prion disease known to occur in free-ranging wildlife. And it's similar to diseases like scrapie in sheep and bovine spongiform encephalopathy in cattle. And there's a couple of human forms of the disease, or similar types of prion diseases in people and humans. Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease is an example. But with CWD, this is almost exclusively a disease of cervids. Pretty much any cervid species is considered susceptible. There does seem to be some resistance in fallow deer, but still most cervid species are susceptible. It has been detected in feral swine in areas where CWD occurs in deer, and feral swine populations exist. So that's some relatively new findings. And there have been some experimental transmission of the prion to other species, including some primates. There's no known human infections, but still it's something we want to avoid, consuming CWD positive venison. So as the video mentioned, the prion is secreted in all bodily fluids, so feces, saliva, urine, and so it can be transmitted directly between cervids, but it can also be transmitted indirectly through the environment. So if an area is contaminated, deer can contract the disease through ingestion of some of those infected materials, and those And the unfortunate quality of CWD is that it can persist in the environment for possibly decades. It's very resistant to degradation. It can survive freezing, incineration, even up until certain temperatures are reached. So it's a very persistent infectious agent. And once it gets into the environment, it's very difficult to eradicate, if not impossible. So when transmission does occur in an animal, the incubation period, or the time between exposure and when they actually develop disease, can be pretty long, at least 16 months. And so a deer can look and act perfectly normal, but have chronic wasting disease and test positive for it and potentially transmit it to other deer. But after that 16 months or a couple year period, incubation period, the disease will slowly progress, first with behavioral changes, weight loss, but inevitably neurological signs, and eventually leading to death. So this is a uniformly fatal disease in cervids. They don't survive it. And so the disease was first recognized in Western states. So no one's really sure when it began, but it appears to have originated in Wyoming or Colorado, possibly back in the 50s, 40s. Hard to say, but it was first recognized as a disease syndrome in the late 60s. And it kind of remained an obscure disease of deer in Western states until in 2004, the Wisconsin DNR proactively began doing surveillance for chronic wasting disease in Wisconsin. And they found it pretty soon afterwards. And then it was shortly after that, it was detected in Illinois. You can see from this map, it's also at that time up in Colorado, parts of Utah and New Mexico. And then slowly over the years, it has spread, and as was mentioned in the video, this could occur from natural dispersal, but more commonly from transport of infected deer, whether it's carcasses or live cervids. And so by 2016, it's in eastern states, West Virginia, Pennsylvania. Here we are in 2020 and 2021. So it's really spread alarmingly. It's now in 26 states, and just recently was detected in Manitoba, so 4 Canadian provinces. It's also in some parts of Scandinavia, Norway and Sweden. So far, it has not been found in the Southeast, but where it is occurring, it's definitely having an impact on populations, and the prevalence is slowly increasing, and age classes are being shifted, and lower survivability is being seen in those populations. And so one of the goals of any agency that does not yet have CWD is, for one, to prevent it from coming in, but then if it does arrive, to be able to detect it early. So here in Florida, we're doing CWD surveillance in 2 ways. We're doing targeted surveillance or passive surveillance. And this is where deer that are found sick or observed sick or dead of unknown causes can be reported to FWC through this hotline, this 1-866-293-9282, and can be reported by the public, other agencies. We monitor that hotline 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and we will do our best to collect that carcass. And when we do, we do a complete necropsy on the deer. So these deer are very sensitive indicators of chronic wasting disease. In positive states, they're up to 30 times more likely to have CWD than your average hunter-killed deer. But importantly, we're looking for other important diseases of white-tailed deer in Florida. So whether that's cranial abscesses, as you can see in this photo, New World screwworm, or other regulatory diseases like tuberculosis or heartwater, or even potentially, we do see episodic hemorrhagic disease fairly frequently, and blue tongue. So we're looking for not just CWD, but taking advantage of these necropsies to look for other important diseases too. And then the other component of this surveillance is active surveillance. So this is the statewide sampling of very large numbers, upwards of 2,000 or more deer per year that are hunter killed or road killed. So this is just to kind of spread a wide net and survey as many deer in as many areas as possible in a year. And this is a good complement to passive surveillance because we're really only getting some relatively small numbers of deer that way. For these deer, we only need the head. The samples that we need to diagnose chronic wasting disease are lymph nodes and a part of the brain stem, both located in the head. So the skull cap and antlers can be removed without damaging those samples. So we do have a lot of hunt clubs, a lot of hunters participate in this and provide heads for us to be able to sample. Whether they remove the skull cap and antlers, is completely up to them. And so between these two methods of surveillance, we've tested over 16,000 deer since the program began in 2002, and so far have not detected CWD in Florida. If it is detected, we have a response plan and an operations plan, and which is an interagency program to respond to CWD if it does occur in Florida, but hopefully that won't be the case. And I believe, yep, that's all the slides I had. So I think at this point we're open for questions.
Great, thanks so much, Mark. If you wanted to go ahead and end your screen share. Perfect. All right, we had a couple questions. Let me pull them up. Cory, this one might be more for you. You did address the second part of Don's question, which was about trends in annual Florida deer harvest, but he was also asking about trends in the annual number of Florida deer hunting licenses. Do you have any data you can share about if that's trending up or down?
Generally speaking, most states, and particularly in Florida, hit our highest license sales back around the 80s sometime. And since then, there generally been a decline in the number of hunting licenses sold in the state. And then it leveled off here in the 2000s. But what we've seen over the last few years, and then also back during the last recession, is an uptick in license sales as more people take advantage of the opportunity for that natural resource and that quality, truly organic meat. And so right now, I would say that they're generally stable, maybe slightly increasing.
And Cory, I have a couple other location-specific questions, and feel free to say if this is not something you're able to answer. But there's a question about the rut period in Grove Park, WMA. Is that something you know?
Yeah, so in that area in particular, you're looking at a rut that's usually in November, even into late October. So we have more detailed rut information on our website at myfwc.com/deer. We have a section there that details rut dates at a finer level. But I'd say, Halloween, late October to early November would be a good time to find rutting activity in that area. So if you hunt that area right now would be a good time to be in the woods.
Great. A few more questions have come in via the chat. There's a question about one of our participants is in Jefferson County and is asking about a loss of deer population due to neighbors' activities, and if there's anything that can be done to restore the area's deer population.
Yeah, I missed what the question indicated might have caused the deer decline.
Yeah, they're saying a neighboring farmer seems to have decimated the deer population over the last 2 years using night vision goggles and the ability to kill nuisance deer.
Okay, yeah, we have a program that allows farmers to deal with deer that are causing significant crop damage. And in general, we encourage hunters to work with their neighboring landowners and try to help their neighboring landowners accomplish their harvest management goals. And so through cooperative agreements, those hunters may be able to help harvest some of those deer. And in general, if you want to see more deer on your property, the basic rule is harvest fewer does.
Great. Great. We have one attendee wondering why deer harvest has decreased in the past decade. Is that, if you have anything you want to say to that, Cory?
Yeah, so we did have a couple of peak harvest years. And part of that was a change in survey methodology. We used to do the annual hunter survey by mail. And when we changed our technique to telephone surveys that we deemed more efficient and better at obtaining those harvest data and harvest effort information from hunters, we saw a difference and a more steady and stable harvest over time being indicated by those surveys. So some of that is a change in methodology.
And this question could be for you or Mark. Do you have an estimate of the size of the deer population in Florida?
The deer densities in Florida vary greatly, as we talked about. That's why we have deer management units. We do not try to put a number on the deer population in Florida, and states that do that will admit that those numbers are wildly inaccurate. And so it really depends on where you're at in the state, if you have a higher or lower deer density, but no, we don't put a number on an estimate on the total number of deer in the state.
Got it. We have another participant asking if deer eat invasive plants, and if that, as a potential help for managing invasive plant species.
If it's a viable food species, certainly they will eat it. A lot of the common invasive plants in Florida may not be suitable deer forage. And so their impact on those will be minimal. And even on ones that they do browse upon, they're not likely to really keep those in control. It's really man-led efforts, human efforts to, spray and do other mechanical methods of controlling invasive plants in the state that have the most benefit.
We had a great question. Some of our previous conversations have been about panthers and bears and the impact of car collisions on the deer population, or those populations. And so they're asking if car deer collisions are also a factor in Florida, and if so, if there's a sense of how large of an issue that is.
Yeah, and so each year State Farm puts out a report of the estimated number of deer vehicle collisions per state. And while we have all seen roadkill deer if we're driving through rural areas or even suburban areas. However, Florida ranks near the bottom of the list in the number of deer vehicle collisions based in proportion to the human population. And that's, partly reflective of our overall lower deer population as compared to West Virginia, who leads the nation usually annually in the number of deer vehicle collisions. So they certainly have an impact, but it's a minimal overall on the deer population in Florida.
Great. Our next question is about if there's any restrictions on using real-time remote cameras to follow if there's bucks in an area.
Yeah, with the proliferation of game trail cameras over the past couple of decades, they certainly aid hunters in locating game and helping to develop a game plan for pursuing game in certain areas. But the bottom line is that the hunter still has to get out there and hunt, locate good sign, and hunt. And the majority of hunters, as indicated by our survey, don't harvest a deer in a given year. It's upwards of 60% of hunters, licensed hunters, don't harvest a deer in a given year. So even though there are some technological advances that aid in scouting for deer, they're naturally adaptive and have great hearing and senses that still make them very difficult to harvest.
Great. And this is a question that you or Mark could answer, asking about what is the natural lifespan of deer?
I'll take a stab, but I mean, generally they're not living longer than 10 years, just based on the tooth wear. Of course, in a wild setting, Cory, what would be the longevity in free-ranging deer, you think?
Yeah, typically we see the deer often being harvested in that 2.5 to 3.5 year old range. However, we'll age deer occasionally that are 7, 8 years old in the wild, which is certainly on the older side in the wild for sure.
Great, Mark, I'm going to stay with you for a couple of biology specific questions, if that's okay. We have a participant asking what happens to people if they eat deer meat with chronic wasting disease.
At this point, there are no known cases of CWD in people. So people have been eating infected venison for decades in Western states, and there's been pretty detailed epidemiological studies looking at causes of death and neurodegenerative diseases in people in those Western states, looking to see if venison consumption was a risk factor, and there's been no association. So no evidence that transmission to people occurs naturally, but still the CDC recommends strongly that people do not consume infected venison. So the risk is definitely there, especially in a theoretical setting. So, there's a lot of experimental studies that show that primates are potentially susceptible to CWD if that barrier, that blood-brain barrier, is crossed with the prion protein. So it's theoretically possible, but no known cases.
Great. And we had, Mark, kind of in that vein of another question about human to deer disease transmission. We have participant wondering if any deer have been tested for COVID.
So in Florida, deer have not been tested for COVID. We, potentially could participate in studies that are looking at that, but there's no reason to believe that they haven't been exposed. So COVID has been detected in deer in other states, both, the actual virus itself and a fairly large percentage of deer that are serologically positive. So deer are being exposed somehow, and it's believed they're then transmitting the virus to other deer, deer to deer. The prevalence can be fairly high. I want to say 30 to 40%. And but to my knowledge, there haven't been any clinical cases of disease in deer. They just seem to be able to be infected with the virus.
A lot of a couple more great questions. Unfortunately, we're at 4 minutes left, and Newton, I see you've had your hand up. So Newton, if you want to unmute Newton and ask your question, and then we'll allow time for our guests to have any final thoughts. And if your questions weren't answered, I'll go ahead and send them in an email to Mark and Cory, and then I can email you back with responses. So Newton, if you want to go ahead and be our last question.
Thank you. And I'll ask the famous question. Can you hear me?
Sure can.
Oh, thank you. I'm a member of the FWC Deer Management Technical Advisory Group. And I can remember when Cory took over the job. And I just want to congratulate Cory and the FWC team that he works with for bringing Florida into the 21st century of deer management. And it has showed that we are getting good customer reports back. And I can only say that we have a difficult situation in Florida managing deer, but we have a good team doing it. And it's very much appreciated. Thank you.
Appreciate
Well,
the
that's a
kind
great
words.
comment. That's a great one to end on. Cory and Mark, I want to see if you guys had any follow-up thoughts given the or anything you wanted to make sure we shared before we left today.
Yeah, just wanted to let you know that if you have any deer questions, and you're always welcome to reach out to us. My email address was on the first screen, but it's cory.morea@myfwc.com. And so feel free to reach out to me anytime you have a question. We'll be happy to assist you. And thank you for participating.
Yeah, and likewise, my email address is mark.cunningham@myfwc.com. And if you're interested in participating in CWD surveillance, or you see deer that are sick or dead of unknown causes, please call that hotline, 866-293-9282 or 866-CWD-WATCH. We get most of our deer through that hotline. So it's extremely helpful.
Well, I want to just thank both Cory and Mark for your time, not only today, but leading up to today, and your willingness to participate in this. And I want to thank everyone else for joining us, taking an hour out of your busy day for the really fantastic questions. And again, if we weren't able to get to yours, I'll be sure to send them along to Cory and Mark so they can answer them. And if we have your email address, follow up directly with you. If maybe we don't have your email address and you want to make sure, you can shoot me an email, mashton@wildlifeflorida.org. Or if you received our email yesterday with the link for today, you can reply to that, and that comes to me if that's easier to remember. And just thank you everyone again, and really appreciate your time.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.